After that trip to Tuba City, Arizona, I can say that I'm truly exhausted. Our rising ninth graders have a lot of energy, and they are an amazing bunch, and we had a wonderful time. But part of this sermon series of experimenting and getting the church to be involved in what it means to experiment, I decided that I'll start my sermon off with making you guys experiment. So I'm going to ask you to do something that I'm pretty sure most of you have probably never done here at North Atlanta, but something that we do quite often in the congregation I come from back home. So I'm going to ask you to stand. I always wanted to do that. And so what I want you to do this morning, I want you to go to at least 4 people this morning. And I'm hoping that you'll go to people that you normally don't see every Sunday, or the people that are sitting next to you. And I want you to give them a handshake, a holy hug, and tell them that you love them, that you're glad that they're here this morning. So maybe you have to go across the room, or maybe you have to go to the back, or maybe those who are in the rafters, you have to come down, or maybe you have to go up. But I want you to move out of your seat and just embrace someone this morning, because the relationship part of this experimentation is key. And we'll come back together after a selection of a song, but I want everybody to move and to embrace someone else.
Who are missing? Susan. Jesus is Lord, my Redeemer, and how He loves me, and how I love Him, and He is risen, and He is coming, and Lord, come quickly, say hallelujah, say what a friend we, and what a friend we have in Jesus, and all our sins and griefs to bear, and what a privilege to carry, saying everything to my God in prayer. Say hallelujah and hallelujah and hallelujah and hallelujah and hallelujah. Lord, come quickly. Say hallelujah. Everybody say hallelujah, hallelujah, and hallelujah, and hallelujah, and hallelujah, and Lord, come quickly. Say hallelujah. One more time, just sing hallelujah, hallelujah, and hallelujah. Sing hallelujah, and hallelujah, and hallelujah, and hallelujah. Sing hallelujah. Please, Lord, come quickly, and Lord, come quickly. Sing hallelujah.
I'd say we passed our experiment. I appreciate the praise team because I didn't tell them beforehand. But it was great to see the experiment, to try something outside of the norm, to do something that we might not have done before. But also my nerves and my jitters were so high I needed it. I just needed the touch and the encouragement of others. As you have heard, Don has been in the hospital, and I got word of this Wednesday around 4 o'clock in the morning while in Tuba City. And during that period, I was texting between Ken, emailing between Julie, texting and emailing, and sending some Facebook messages with Don. And Don was, of course, being Don, always so optimistic, and his faith is just so vibrant that honestly, just talking to him made it sound like he was going to be here today. Honestly, like, I'm still shocked. But then Ken was the voice of my reason, and Ken was like, just to be on the safe side, you might want to start preparing. And then, of course, they sent me the listing of everything that was going in worship, and Don was still in there, and I was supposed to do the announcements and the prayer. And then when they inserted my name into the preaching slot, I was like, man, this looks like a one-man worship. And so I asked them, I was like, are we going to change some of these things around? They were like, we'll see. We'll make it work. So this whole experience this morning isn't clearly us experimenting. This is truly outside of our norm. But this sermon series that we've been going through this summer, dealing with spiritual formation, dealing with Jesus and the concept of on this rock, when Jesus says in Matthew, the 16th chapter, beginning at verse 18, Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. On this rock, on this foundation, I will build my church. And from this, we look at Luke in the 2nd chapter, in the 52nd verse. Luke gives this description of Jesus, and it says, and Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So at the beginning of the year, we looked at Jesus growing in wisdom, and here we are now at Jesus growing in stature and in favor with God and man will come later on this year. So in June, we looked at the imagination process and reimagining, and what does it mean to look at God, look at the text, look at our spiritual life in new and refreshing ways. Ways that we have yet to consider, or maybe the way that we had once thought was right, maybe we can go back and reevaluate them and maybe get a different perspective. And what does that look like, and what would that cause us to do? How would that change our lives? So once we began to reimagine, now we have moved into the part of experimentation. How do we go about putting things that we've now seen differently into action? Or trying new things, trying to do things differently. Now, of course, doing things differently for the sake to say we did it differently is not worth it. But to do something differently, if it causes a change within us that draws us closer to God, it draws us closer to one another, is something that's worth it. And so in this series of experimentation, we're looking for ways in which it draws us closer to the heart of God. How do we begin to experiment with our spiritual lives so we become more connected as a community, more connected as a church, but most importantly, become more connected to God? And so what we're going to do this morning is look at the experimentation process. So when I first started out at ACU, I was a biology major. Yes, me, biology major. Hard sciences. I still love them. But the reason why I think I love them so much is because it's a lot like ministry. It's a lot of process and few answers. I enjoy ministry for the same reason. I enjoy the process. I enjoy the methodology. For me, the answers are relative, and if I get them, I get them. If I don't, I don't. But I enjoy going through the process of things. And this experimentation is a lot like that. God is a God of experimentation. God experiments. God tries things. He tries new things, and he does things over. And God calls us into that same lifestyle. We see that in the beginning in Genesis, after God has created everything, Adam and Eve are in the garden. After the sin, God comes through all the way after Cain and Abel and the birth of Seth. Before the Noah story, we get in chapter 6, God said, I saw how great the wickedness of human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth and the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. God said this first experiment that I tried with humanity was a failure. My first attempt at experimenting with humankind and my creation didn't go so well. I didn't really get the process right. I want you to think about it. This is God. God is saying that I had a failed attempt here. I missed it on this one. I didn't get it correct. But we thank God because God still says that I'm trying. He finds righteousness in Noah and he starts over with creation. But God's first inclination is saying that when I looked at what I had done, this experiment didn't go so well. So then we see Jesus in the New Testament, and Jesus is doing the same thing. He's calling us to experiment, to try things. But I always have in the back of my mind when I think of experiment, I have that scientific method thing that I did all the time in biology and chemistry class. And so I want us to look at this scientific method and look at how the text follows this process, how Jesus walks his disciples through this method of questioning, coming up with the hypothesis, putting a test to it, analyzing it, and reevaluating it. Jesus asked his disciples to walk through this same method of experimenting. So we find that in Luke, the 6th chapter, when Jesus selects his disciples, it says in the 12th verse, one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Now, I want you to realize it says that he chose 12 of them, so there must have been more than just the 12. Jesus says, I'm going to experiment with these ones. Out of the ones that are available, I'm going to select 12 to do this experiment. I'm going to entrust you with this task. And so he gets Simon, whom he named Peter. His brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who so sadly gets named as the traitor in the Bible. I think I would kind of hate for my description to have that every time. But when you take a step back and you look at these individuals, these 12 disciples who become apostles, what makes them so special? Why are they so grand? Why did Jesus choose these 12 to experiment with? Who are these people? You have Andrew, who is referenced by his relationship to Peter, who's a fisherman. What's so special about him? Bartholomew, from what we know, became a missionary in Armenia. We assume, based on his reference, that he is linked to the lineage of David through his mother. James the elder, who was brother of John the apostle, was also a fisherman. The other James, who was the lesser or the younger, who is referenced by being the son of Alphaeus, he's only referenced in his relationship to his brother, the apostle Jude. The other John, the sons of Zebedee, who's the brother of James, he who we refer to as the beloved disciple in his own gospel, was also a fisherman. Then we have Judas Iscariot, who, as the text labels, the traitor. Then you have Jude, who's also the other son, but the brother of James, the younger. We don't know anything else about him. Matthew, who we believe is the tax collector or the publican, but depending on which version of the synoptics you read, he's either called Matthew or Levi. Then you have Simon Peter, the other fisherman, who goes on to be what some consider the first church official. Then you have Simon the Zealot, who's part of this community. And then you have Thomas, called Didymus, who's only referenced by where he lives in Galilee. Jesus selects 12 random individuals. There's nothing overly special about them that we know of. We don't know that they have any great ability, any specific task that they're just so accustomed to that they do better than anyone else. He just somehow selects these 12 among the rest. And he says, I'm going to experiment with you. I'm going to ask you to join this experiment. Well, what kind of experiment are you asking us to go on, Jesus? Well, one of the things that really struck me about the Tuba City trip was what the student ministry does. Even though they were there doing all this work and we were helping out on this Indian reservation, the whole time we were experimenting. If you know Justin Bagwell, we were experimenting. But the whole point of the experimentation was building community. See, from the first day we got there, our motto was, what are you here for? There you go. Our whole understanding was the reason what we're here for is Jesus. Wherever that leads us, wherever that takes us, whatever that makes us do, we're going to do it. And we realize that we're not going to be able to plan this out as perfectly as we want to. There's going to be some things we get right. There's going to be some things we get wrong. At the end of the day, we're going to come back, have a worship service debrief, and we're going to try it all over again tomorrow. We're going to repeat the process of experimenting. But it wasn't about getting everything correctly all the time. It's about following the process and following Jesus. So if that's the first step and the most important step, then everything else will work out just okay. I promise you it'll work out just fine as it did in Tuba City. So when we went on this hike, which I thought after going on this hike, I was like, Justin, you are the most brave youth minister I've ever met in my life. For parents, if you didn't know what your children did at Tuba City, Lord help them. I mean, here we are climbing this rock with a rope that's, we hope, is secure. Then we're jumping off this ledge. I mean, we are clearly in this canyon just going all out. But because we had come to the early understanding that morning, we're doing this for Jesus. Everybody was okay with it. Nobody decided to ask any more questions. Nobody was like, Justin, where are you taking us? Justin, are you sure this is okay? Justin was like, I've done this plenty of times. We're going to do it for Jesus. We're going to go. And that was the end of it. We were willing to commit ourselves to following because we knew that we all had the same faith in Jesus. It didn't matter where we were going to go thereafter, but because Jesus was the centerpiece, the focal point, we were willing to take the risk. But the night before, Justin said something very important. As we were preparing and he was getting them all ready for this canyon, which is a very serious event, because, I mean, it really is dangerous. A lot of things could go wrong. We got together and he said, if you try to outshine while you're out there, you're only holding us back. He said, we have to do this together. Every time that you step out of line and you try to do something or you try to show off, all you're doing is holding the rest of the group back. And I had to sit there and process that for a moment. Had to think about that. Every time you try to do something for you or to show off or to be seen, all you're doing is holding us back. Because he said the only way we're going to make it is if we all work together. If we all do this together with the same focus that Christ is the reason we're doing this, it'll be fine. If for one moment you stop believing that this is about Jesus and you start taking the spotlight, this experimentation is going to fail. It's going to fall apart. And in this canyon, you're not just in a redo mode. There's lives at stake. There's a lot of danger here. Things could go seriously wrong. But this is the physical world. What if we had that same mindset in our spiritual lives? If we realized that here in the church, that when each of us step out of line, that we're just holding the rest of the congregation back. Because we believe that it's all about Jesus and we can only do this if we completely commit ourselves to doing it together. I want you to imagine what that would happen. What would happen to this world if we took that mindset? What would our church look like if we fully committed ourselves to doing everything only to glorify God and not self, and we realize that if I do it wrong or if I don't give my best, then I'm holding the rest of the congregation back? How would that change North Atlanta? How would that change our service to each other? How would it change our service to the rest of the world? How would it impact the community in which this congregation exists? See, this is the experiment that Jesus calls his disciples to. Jesus says, I'm experimenting with you just as much as I'm asking you to experiment with your faith in me. I'm asking you to trust me enough to go on the journey, even though you might not know where you're going, but you have the faith in me to know that I won't lead you the wrong way. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I haven't already given you the capacity to do. I'm not going to ask you to go anywhere that I haven't prepared for you to go. And nothing that I'm going to ask you to do, I've given you everything you need to accomplish it. Which means I've given you the people around you to get it done. But I'm not asking you to go out there and be a star alone. I'm asking you to go out there with me on your mind and doing it for my glory. And anytime you forget that, you're just holding the rest of the people back. See, the reason why we decided on this experimentation series is because we realized that in some cases we've held people back. As a congregation, we haven't always stepped up to the forefront with the mindset that everything has to be about God and has to be about the unification of God and God's people. And because we don't always approach things with that mindset, we began to see ourselves falling further and further behind culture. And we began to not be able to answer the questions of the world that's crying out for our help. Because all we're able to do is to give them bad answers and give them a bad example because it's all about us. And what the world needs to see is it being about Jesus. And they need to see us being about Jesus together and unified so we glorify God. And so when we choose to do things that are unorthodox or outside of our norm, it's okay because we realize we're doing it for Jesus. That's the reason we're doing it. We might not always have all the answers, but we have the process in place to try. It's okay to try and fail as long as you're trying to do it right for Jesus. But we need to be in community and relationship with one another so we can bounce those ideas, those comments, those thoughts off one another to help us come to a better conclusion of what we need to be doing. But if it's about me, if it's about me trying to get the spotlight or me trying to do it for me, what I end up doing is holding the rest of the congregation back. See, for too long, Christianity has been viewed through the eyes of the world by the people who do it wrong best. Is that not true? Have you never had an interaction with somebody who thought they knew everything about Christianity and they thought you were just like everybody else, only for you to have to spend your time trying to convince them that you're not like someone else who has the same Christian label as you? And Jesus is saying that the reason this happens, the way that you counteract this, if you actually get on the same page and do it for me, this won't be the issue. This only comes about because you try to do it for you. And in the end, you end up holding the rest of them back. We get a bad rap for the few, not because of the many. It's the few who do the things that begin to overcast everyone else. And it's in the mind and the eyes of the world that they think that all of us are the same. And Jesus is saying, no, there's a difference between some of these. These 12 are different than the rest. For some reason, Jesus called them out. And Jesus said, I'm going to experiment with some fishermen, a tax collector, some unknown people, and one that's going to betray me. I'm going to do an experiment with them. And at the end of the day, when Jesus hung on the cross, they all deserted him and left him. And Jesus was like, that's part of the experiment. That's part of what I'm asking you to do, to try something new, to try something that you haven't done before. So what exactly are we going to try to do? What would be beneficial for our congregation to try to do? One of the slides that Don had from last week was so resonating, I decided to go ahead and pull it in. And it said, experimentation is essential. Don't be afraid to fail. See, in that Genesis passage, God wasn't afraid of failure. But I want you to think about if he was. If God was so afraid of failure, he would have never recreated. He would have never started again. There would be no you, there would be no me. But God says, that's not who I am. It's in my nature to create. It's in my nature to experiment, to do things again. And us being made in the image and likeness of God, we too have to experiment and try things anew and do them again. We experiment each and every day in our lives, whether we realize it or not. Each time you go out there and turn your car on, it's an experiment to those people on the road. I'll just admit it. People in the South just can't drive. That's my view. I'll just admit it. I'm skeptical of people in the South and their driving habits. And the people who North Atlanta who shared with me that they didn't even have to pass the driving test to get a license just helped me confirm that. When we decide to go off to college, when we decide to start a family, marriage is an experiment. All these things are experiments in our lives. But when it comes to our spiritual relationship, we feel that it's difficult to step outside and do that same experimentation. So why do we feel so restrained that we can't experiment any longer when it comes to God? Why can't we put God to the test as God is also experimenting with us? See, when you truly step back and read the scripture, all you see is God experimenting with humankind. From Abraham on, God is experimenting with his people to try to get them somewhere, hoping that they will put enough faith in him to get them where he needs them to go. Israel was an experiment. And when you step back and look at it, it looks horribly wrong. But God doesn't give up on the experiment. To see his only son be crucified on the cross is an experiment that looks really bad, but somehow in that experiment we get redemption. God is constantly experimenting. He's saying that if I didn't experiment, I wouldn't ask you to do it. But because I do, I expect it out of you. I expect you to experiment with your faith, to go to places that you've never gone before, interact with people that you've never interacted with. And that's part of the reason why I asked you to do what I did at the beginning of this message. Because it gets you outside of your box. It gets you experimenting at the beginning, to interact with people that you haven't interacted with. But as I began to look at this text and look at what's going on, I began to see some things that really need to be experimented with. As most of you know, I'm doing my master's at Emory, at Candler School of Theology. And my emphasis is on church growth and church relations. I'm a nerd, of course, but I enjoy looking at how churches function and grow and how they change and shift and how they maneuver over time. And one of the things that I see constantly in my research of healthy congregations are congregations that aren't afraid to experiment. They're not afraid to try new things or to try different things. They're not afraid of failure because they realize that God is faithful. That I don't have to get it right. I just have to do the best I can for God and let God do what God does best. God makes up for the lack or the slack in what we can and can't do. And so when I was on this trip, I began to see a part of the system. I see a student ministry that's so vibrant. These young people who are truly giving their heart to God. And they're truly worshiping. I mean, those nights of worship were, honestly, they're indescribable. There are not enough words that I could ever use in the human language to describe what took place in those moments, in those events. But for some of us in here, we'll never know what it's like to worship with them unless you choose to experiment. You'll never know what it's like. But see, at the same time, we have some remarkable people who have amazing talents to do incredible things. But unless we engage them and get to know them, we'll never know unless we choose to experiment. See, North Atlanta has every tool that it needs to be what God wants it to be. We just have to be willing to experiment with implementing those tools and allowing those people to flourish in the areas in which they've been called and which they've been gifted. But that's difficult sometimes because I don't really like to experiment past my boundaries. I have my limits. And my limit on that trip to Arizona was I'm not going in this cold Colorado River. That was a failed experiment. But see, this is how God treats us. When we tell God we're no longer going to experiment with him, our relationship begins to dwindle with him. Because God has never called you to a place of mediocrity or a place of stagnant. We have to constantly be moving ahead, going forward, which means we have to constantly be experimenting with God. And God is saying that I'm not going to stop. So you just have to keep up. And yes, that's hard, that's difficult, but I tell you right now, just being on the mission trip, it's the greatest journey in life to run a race experimenting with God. and knowing that even if I mess up, even if I blow it, I mean, just think about it. If I blow it, I know that God is faithful. That in the midst of me blowing it, God can do something amazing. And if you don't believe it, read the Gospels. There's no better example of humanity blowing it and God saying that I can fix it. You see Peter, who denies Jesus 3 times and becomes one of the pillars of the church. You see Paul, who was a murderer and a persecutor of the church, become the greatest missionary that we've ever known. You see David, who was a liar and adulterer, become the man who has a heart for God. And you're like, how does this happen? Because they're not afraid to experiment. They're not afraid to try things that haven't been tried before. And they're not doing it for the show. They're not doing it to be seen. But they're doing it because they're trying to get at the heart of God. And they want to bring others to the heart of God. I believe that North Atlanta resides very close to the heart of God. I truly believe that. If I didn't, honestly, I wouldn't be here. I believe that with everything in me that we reside so close to the heart of God. And I think that the next step for us is to continue with our experimentation of figuring out how we can make the next move to get even closer. How we can get closer as a family and how we can get closer to God. And saying, you know what, if we blow it, it's okay, we'll try something else. See, what I learned in chemistry class is that it's not always about getting the hypothesis right. It's about finding a plan that actually works. See, because when you go through the scientific experiment, once you get through the hypothesis, you actually do a plan, then you execute the plan, then you go back and look at the data, then you go back and reevaluate, and usually what you do then is like, man, I should have tried a different plan. Or maybe I should have asked a different question. And all that's the reevaluation process, and that's the continual process of life. Our spiritual life is one of experimentation and reevaluation, and we just continually go through that with God. And as long as we have that mindset that we're here and that what we do on this earth is for no one else but Jesus, we don't have to be afraid to experiment. We don't have to be afraid that if we try something and it doesn't work out the way we thought it should, that God is just going to lose it on us. Because God says that I'm faithful. I can find someone righteous in the midst of all wickedness. I can turn your mess into a blessing for someone else. I can take your shortcomings and stretch them out a mile long and use them as a bridge for someone else to get closer to me. But if you don't try anything, if you're not willing to walk the race with me, then you'll find yourself holding the rest of the congregation back. And I'll admit that I've at times held people back. I have been a stumbling block to people in my life because it wasn't always about Jesus. But when it becomes about Jesus, we'll prosper. We'll be everything that God has called us to be in every way that he wants us to be it. So in Mark, the first chapter, Jesus says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Jesus is telling them that I want you to experiment with me as I'm going to experiment with you. This is a two-way street of experimentation. It's not about trying to get it perfect. It's about doing it because you love me and because you have complete and total faith in who I am and what I'm capable of doing. And so we see after Jesus calls his disciples, he sends them out into these remote places. He tells them to take nothing with them. And they come back so excited and overjoyed at the things they're able to do because of Jesus. And they don't even know how to really explain what happened. And Jesus says, don't be thankful that you got to do these miracles. Be thankful because your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. See, church, our names are already written. There's nothing you're going to do to change that. You've gotten the grace of God. You've been forgiven by God. You've been redeemed by God. So you don't have a reason not to experiment with God. your relationship status isn't going to change. You're not going to be any less of a son or a daughter to God because of what you do. So then let's put our trust and our faith in Jesus. And let's say, Jesus, we're going to experiment with you. We're going to go where you ask us to go. Do what you ask us to do. And even if we blow it, we'll come back to the drawing board and we'll reevaluate and see how we can do it better the next time. But we're never going to stop trying and trying to do what we can to glorify you and affect your kingdom while we're here on this earth. So maybe you've been in a position where you've held people back. I don't know your story. Maybe you've stopped experimenting altogether and you've gotten too comfortable where you are. Maybe you don't even know how to experiment. You don't know where to start. See, we have a moment where our shepherds come down, and you have an opportunity to meet them here. And if you can't meet them here, they'll come to you, believe me. I love this church for that very reason. Our shepherds are real people with real lives, and they care about this community. So if you need them, they'll see you, and they'll do whatever they can to make your life all about Jesus and to get you back on the experimenting path. But as a congregation, we have to hold each other accountable and encourage one another to experiment. When we see our brothers and sisters stagnant in their faith and in their relationship, we have to ask them, when have you tried something differently in a while? When's the last time you experimented with God? So for this week, for the rest of this week, I want to challenge us to do something you haven't done with God. Maybe today you go to a Bible class that you've never gone to before. Maybe that's your experiment. Maybe you go out to lunch with someone that you know you need to build a relationship with them. Maybe you take a moment and talk to that person on the job who needs your assistance, who just needs a listening ear. I don't know what your experiment's going to be, but I want to challenge us to do so, to experiment with God, realizing that he's faithful, and that even if we blow it, even if we mess it up completely, God can do something redemptive with it. I ask that you take that challenge as we stand and the praise team comes and leads us in our song.